My name is Adelaide Lawrence, and I am 32 years old. Last Tuesday, my older brother inherited our family's $50 million shipping empire, and I was handed a single envelope sealed with 30-year-old red wax. He sat at the head of the boardroom table, smirked in front of the entire legal team, and told me it was probably an apology for having me. But when I cracked that wax seal and placed the single sheet of paper on the mahogany table, the room stopped breathing. The lead corporate counsel read the first paragraph, went pale, and looked at my brother. He said, "James, you do not own the ships. You never did." Before I tell you how a single piece of paper brought a billionaire to his knees, please take a moment to subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments, because I want to know who is listening to this right now. Now let me take you back to that glass-walled boardroom overlooking Puget Sound in Seattle, Washington, and the exact moment my brother realized he was trapped. Rain tracked diagonal lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Lawrence Maritime headquarters. Inside the room, the only sound was the sharp rustle of heavy bond paper. Marcus Thorne, our lead corporate counsel, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. To my son, James Lawrence, I leave the entirety of my operating shares holding companies and physical assets pertaining to Lawrence Maritime. James leaned back in his leather chair. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that pulled taut across his shoulders. He did not smile, but his jaw relaxed. The golden boy had inherited the kingdom. Thorne turned the next page. He paused. His brow furrowed a fraction of an inch. He set the main will down, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick envelope. The parchment was yellowed at the edges, sealed with a dark crimson wax stamp. And to my daughter Adelaide Thorne, read his voice dropping a register. "I leave this." Thorne slid the envelope across the polished table. It stopped inches from my folded hands. I stared at the red wax. It smelled faintly of dried pine and dust. It was the exact scent of my father's home, study a room with a heavy oak door that had remained locked to me for my entire life. While James had been groomed for the executive suite, handed a vice presidency at 24, I had spent a decade in the fluorescent-lit sub-basements of the company, auditing supply chain manifests. I knew the weight and routing number of every cargo container in our fleet. James only knew the profit margins. James rested his elbows on the table, tenting his fingers. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then up to me. "Maybe it is an apology for having you." The junior partners sitting at the far end of the table shifted in their seats. Their eyes darted down to their legal pads. I did not blink. I picked up the envelope. The wax felt brittle under my thumb. I cracked the seal. The sound snapped through the quiet room like a dry twig. I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was not a letter of apology. It was not a letter at all. It was a legal instrument. The header bore the faded watermark of a private Swiss bank dated October 1996. My eyes scanned the dense, typewritten paragraphs. Irrevocable trust. Primary beneficiary. Fleet leaseholds. I read the final line signed by my late mother, co-signed by my father. I looked up and slid the document across the mahogany to Thorne. "Verify this." Thorne picked it up. He read the first paragraph. The rhythmic tapping of his pen stopped. He read the second. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. He looked from the paper to James, then back to me. He placed the document face down on the table. "We need to halt this proceeding, now." James dropped his hands. The leather of his chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Excuse me?" "Read the rest of the will, Marcus." "I just inherited the company," James Thorne said, his tone devoid of its usual corporate deference. "You do not own the ships. According to this, you never did." Silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. James reached for the document. I placed my hand flat over the paper, my palm pressing into the watermark, keeping it out of his reach. "The seed money," I said, my voice even, cutting through the quiet. "Dad did not buy the original fleet. Mom did, through a bloodline trust. Dad only held the operational leases. Upon his death, the leaseholds revert to the trust's sole beneficiary. I tapped my index finger against the parchment. Me. James stared at me. The polished veneer of the CEO in waiting cracked. A tight vein pulsed near his left temple. That is a forgery. A piece of garbage you printed in your cubicle. It bears a certified notary seal from 30 years ago. Thorne interrupted softly. If this is authenticated, Adelaide holds a super lien over the entire fleet. To retain operational control, Lawrence Maritime owes the trust a buyout. $25 million, due immediately upon execution. James stood up. His chair hit the glass wall behind him with a dull thud. He looked at Thorne, then at the junior lawyers who were suddenly furiously typing on their laptops. He turned to his briefcase, yanked the zipper open, and pulled out a standard non-disclosure and waiver packet. He threw it across the table. The packet slapped against the wood and slid, stopping against my forearm. "Sign it," James commanded. His voice echoed off the glass. "You sign a waiver renouncing that piece of fiction right now, or you walk out of this building with nothing. You do not have the legal team to fight this, Addie. I will bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt." I looked down at the waiver. I did not reach for the pen. I was an auditor. I spent my life hunting for discrepancies in fine print. I knew the corporate bylaws better than the men who drafted them. Section 4, paragraph 2 of the corporate charter, I recited, meeting his hostile gaze. Any restructuring of asset ownership exceeding 10% requires a board vote and an external audit. You cannot force a waiver on a foundational trust without opening the company ledgers to a federal judge. James froze. His breathing grew shallow. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for a bluff. Finding none. I picked up the 1996 document and folded it precisely along its original creases. I placed it into the inside pocket of my blazer. If the company is worth $50 million, James, a $25 million buyout should not make you sweat. I tilted my head. Unless the accounts are empty. I watched his eyes. They widened just a fraction of an inch. It was enough. He was hiding something in the ledgers. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I did not raise my voice. "I am leaving. If anyone tries to lock those doors, I will call the Seattle police and file charges for false imprisonment against every attorney in this room." Thorne nodded sharply to the junior partners. Nobody moved. I walked out of the boardroom. The click of my heels echoed down the silent marble hallway. I stepped into the elevator, hit the lobby button, and watched the heavy steel doors slide shut, cutting off the sight of my brother's pale face. When I pushed through the revolving doors of the lobby, the Seattle rain hit my face cold and sharp. I pulled my coat tight. The battle line was drawn. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the brittle wax seal, knowing the real fight had not even begun. I drove north from downtown Seattle, the rain beating a steady rhythm against the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan. The heater rattled, blowing lukewarm air against my freezing hands, but I barely felt the chill. My mind was still back in that glass boardroom, replaying the exact shade of pale my brother turned when he realized our mother had outsmarted him from the grave. He thought the empire belonged to him. He thought I would quietly accept my role as the forgotten daughter. He was wrong. But James was arrogant, not stupid. I knew he would retaliate. I just did not realize how fast a billionaire could move when his survival was on the line. I pulled into my neighborhood in Ballard. It was a working-class area of old maritime bungalows and tight apartment complexes, a world away from the sprawling Medina estates where James and my father lived. Before heading up to my unit, I stopped at the corner market to buy a bag of coffee and a sandwich. I had missed lunch during the will reading, and my stomach was a tight knot of adrenaline. I set the items on the counter and swiped my debit card. The terminal beeped a sharp, flat tone. Declined. I frowned and pulled out my primary credit card, sliding the chip into the reader. The screen flashed the same red error code. Declined. Please contact your financial institution. The cashier, a college kid who knew my face, looked away, offering a polite, awkward cough. I handed him a $20 bill from my coat pocket, took my coffee, and walked out into the downpour. By the time I unlocked the door to my second-floor walk-up apartment, my phone was buzzing. It was not a text message. It was an automated alert from my banking application. I dropped my keys on the counter and opened the screen. My checking account read 0. My savings account read 0. Across the top of the interface, a stark yellow banner warned that a legal hold had been placed on all routing numbers associated with my Social Security number. I set the phone down and opened my laptop. I tried to log into my corporate email, the same account I had used every day for 10 years, to verify international shipping manifests for Lawrence Maritime. User not found. He had erased me. In the 45 minutes it took me to drive home from the waterfront, James had deployed a small army of corporate litigators. My personal email pinged with a secure digital delivery from the King County Courthouse. I opened the PDF attachment. It was an emergency ex parte injunction. James had gone straight to a judge behind closed doors without giving me the chance to defend myself. The legal brief accused me of fabricating a fraudulent trust document, attempting to extort a major Seattle corporation, and posing an immediate flight risk. Under the guise of protecting the company assets, James had successfully convinced a judge to freeze my entire financial existence. I stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the rain lash against the window. He was using a classic siege tactic. He wanted to paralyze me. You cannot hire a lawyer if you cannot pay a retainer. You cannot fight a protracted legal battle if you cannot buy groceries. He wanted me to feel so outgunned and terrified that I would crawl back to the boardroom and sign his waiver just to get my life back. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat. I was a supply chain auditor standing in a rented apartment up against a $50 million shipping conglomerate. I had no war chest. I had no legal team. I had only the clothes I was wearing and the wax-sealed document hidden inside my blazer. I closed my eyes and pictured my father. I remembered the way he used to walk past my desk in the sub-basement, never stopping to ask about my work, never acknowledging the millions of dollars I saved the company by catching vendor discrepancies. I pictured James smirking in his bespoke suit, treating the company like a personal ATM, while I memorized the hull numbers of every freighter we operated. I opened my eyes. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people with safety nets. I had a different kind of weapon. I was an auditor. I destroyed people with data. I walked to my hall closet, pushed past winter coats and cardboard boxes, and pulled out a heavy black Pelican case. Inside rested an old Panasonic Toughbook. It was a rugged vendor terminal weighing nearly 8 pounds, built for dockyard foremen. 5 years ago, when the corporate IT department refused to upgrade the software in my basement office, claiming it was not in the budget, I had quietly requisitioned this outdated machine from the scrap pile. I set the heavy laptop on my kitchen table and plugged it into the wall. The screen flickered to life, glowing with a harsh, green luminescence. Because this terminal was originally configured for independent dockside inspections, it bypassed the main Lawrence Maritime firewall. It did not rely on my wiped corporate credentials. It pinged directly to the International Port Authority databases utilizing an independent maritime access key that James and his expensive lawyers did not even know existed. I typed in a string of terminal commands, watching the code cascade down the screen. James had severed my connection to the company, but he forgot that I built the vendor tracking architecture from the ground up. I knew the back door to every ledger. I gained access to the Central Port Registry. My fingers flew across the worn keys. I needed to know why James was so terrified of a $25 million buyout. A healthy shipping empire could absorb that debt. Lawrence Maritime generated immense revenue, unless the revenue was an illusion. I initiated a direct query for our 5 flagship freighters. I knew their International Maritime Organization registration numbers by heart. I typed in the code for the Aurora, our largest vessel capable of carrying 4,000 shipping containers across the Pacific. I hit enter. The database spun, searching the global registry. A line of text appeared. Asset not found. Registration transferred. I stared at the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs. I typed in the registration number for the Pacific Queen. Asset not found. Registration transferred. I ran a batch query for the remaining 3 freighters, the backbone of our entire corporate operation. The screen flashed the same stark warning. None of the ships were registered to Lawrence Maritime. I leaned closer to the monitor, the green light reflecting in my eyes. I traced the digital breadcrumbs following the chain of custody through the Seattle port logs. The data did not lie. James had not just hidden money, he had carved out the very heart of our father's empire. The public records showed that the titles to all 5 ships had been quietly transferred away from our corporate holding over 3 years ago. James had successfully cut off my money and my access. But in his rush to lock the doors, he forgot to sweep the digital floor. He left a trail. I scrolled through the transfer logs, realizing the horrifying truth. The $50 million company James just inherited was nothing but a hollow shell. Lawrence Maritime did not own its own ships anymore, which meant someone else did. I sat back in the quiet glow of the kitchen, recognizing that my brother was not just greedy, he was desperate. He had stolen the fleet and covered his tracks playing the wealthy CEO while standing on a trap door. I had the trust document proving my mother owned the original leases, but enforcing it meant I would inherit a ghost ship. I needed to know exactly who James gave our fleet to, and I knew there was only one man in Seattle who knew where the bodies were buried. A man who was bound by attorney-client privilege, but who also knew my brother was driving the company off a cliff. I stood under the dark green awning of the Metropolitan Grill, watching the valet park a succession of imported sports cars. The Seattle rain had turned the steep downtown streets into slick black rivers, reflecting the neon glow of the financial district. My coat was soaked through the shoulders, and my frozen bank accounts meant I could not afford to tip the coat check, let alone buy a glass of water inside. But I did not need a reservation. I knew Marcus Thorne ate dinner here every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock sharp. For 3 decades, Thorne had served as the legal architect for Lawrence Maritime. He drafted the contracts, shielded the assets, and buried the liabilities. He was a creature of habit, preferring a specific corner booth where he could see the front door while keeping his own back against the mahogany paneling. I pushed through the heavy brass doors, letting the warmth of the restaurant wash over me. The air smelled of charred prime rib, melted butter, and expensive bourbon. Power brokers and tech executives populated the dimly lit tables, murmuring over corporate acquisitions. I ignored the maitre d' and walked straight past the host stand, navigating the narrow aisles between the velvet booths. Thorne was exactly where I expected him to be. He sat alone, an open leather binder resting next to a half-empty glass of amber liquid. He wore the same tailored suit from the boardroom, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the low light of the table lamp. I slid into the curved booth opposite him. I did not ask for permission. Thorne did not flinch. He slowly closed his leather binder, aligning the edges perfectly with the edge of the table. He took a measured sip of his drink and leveled a cold stare at me. "You are currently subject to an emergency ex parte injunction, Adelaide." He kept his voice low, barely rising above the ambient hum of the dining room. Approaching me outside of a formal legal setting is a direct violation of that order. James can have you arrested for harassment before the appetizers arrive. I reached into my wet coat and pulled out a manila envelope. I placed it flat on the white tablecloth, right between his drink and his binder. "My brother drained my checking account and locked me out of the corporate servers," I said, matching his quiet tone. "I have exactly $20 in my pocket. A judge cannot fine me if I do not have a single cent to my name." Thorne glanced at the manila envelope, but did not touch it. I am bound by attorney-client privilege. I cannot discuss ongoing litigation or the internal financial architecture of Lawrence Maritime with a terminated employee. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. Your client is the corporate entity, Marcus. The charter clearly states your fiduciary duty is to protect the shareholders and the foundational assets of the shipping line. Your client is not James Lawrence. James is merely the acting executive, and the acting executive just stole the fleet. Thorne remained perfectly still. A waiter approached holding a silver water pitcher, but Thorne waved him away with a sharp flick of his wrist. I opened the envelope. I did not wait for his legal permission to show him the data. I slid the printed terminal logs across the table, turning the pages so they faced him. The harsh black ink stood out against the crisp white linen. 5 ships, Marcus. I tapped the center of the first page. The Aurora, the Pacific Queen, the Northern Star, the Horizon, the Iron Tide. I bypassed the corporate firewall and queried the International Port Authority registry. Our flagships are gone. The hull numbers are no longer attached to our holding company. James transferred the titles out of our jurisdiction 3 years ago. Thorne stared down at the documents. He did not look surprised. He looked tired. The deep lines around his mouth seemed to deepen in the dim light. I kept the pressure on. You are the lead counsel. You sign off on every major asset transfer. If you authorize the sale of a $50 million fleet without a board vote, you are an accessory to corporate fraud. You will lose your license, and you will go to federal prison right alongside my brother. But I do not think you signed those transfer papers. I think James bypassed you. I think he forged the board approvals and left you in the dark. For a long moment, the only sound was the clinking of silverware from the adjacent tables. Thorne reached out and adjusted his glasses. He looked at the printed logs, then up at my face. He saw the unyielding resolve in my eyes. I was not the quiet supply chain auditor anymore. I was a cornered animal, and I was holding a match. Adelaide, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, if I acknowledge those documents, I am violating the model rules of professional conduct. If I confirm or deny anything regarding the current asset structure of your brother's administration, I will be disbarred. I cannot speak to you about the missing ships. He reached inside his suit jacket. He did not pull out a legal brief or a pen. He pulled out a small, black plastic device. It was a prepaid burner phone, the kind you buy with cash at a convenience store. He placed it on the table and slid it beneath his linen napkin. I cannot speak to you, he repeated, emphasizing the words, but I will tell you this. Your father was a brilliant logistics director, but he was a terrible judge of character. The mention of my father felt like a physical blow. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. Richard built an empire, Thorne said, staring into his glass of bourbon, but he hated confrontation. He spent his entire life avoiding the hard choices. When James crashed a company vehicle at 22, your father paid a fixer to bury the police report rather than discipline his own son. When James started demanding executive power, your father handed him a vice presidency, rather than tell the boy he was not ready. Thorne looked up, meeting my gaze directly. His eyes were cold, analytical, and brutally honest. 3 years ago, the profit margins started shrinking. The quarterly reports did not make sense. Richard knew James was bleeding the company. He saw the red ink. He knew his golden boy was driving the ship directly into the rocks. Then why did he not fire him? I asked, the frustration finally leaking into my voice. Why did he not trigger a board vote and remove James from the executive suite? Because he was a coward, Thorne stated plainly. Richard could not stomach the social embarrassment. He could not walk into the country club and admit that his chosen heir was a thief. He could not bear to look James in the eye and tear down the prince he had created. So he pretended everything was fine. He let the rot spread because it was easier than fighting his own blood. I looked down at the napkin hiding the burner phone. My chest tightened as the true nature of my inheritance began to crystallize. The wax-sealed letter, the hidden trust document, the secret lien on the fleet. It was never a gift. "He left the trust document for you," Thorne said, voicing the exact thought echoing in my head. He knew that when he died, the creditors would eventually come knocking. He knew James would crash the company. "Your father left that 1996 lien in your hands because he wanted you to be the executioner. He knew you were smart enough to find the money and tough enough to pull the trigger. He made you the villain so he could die with his hands clean." The revelation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. For 32 years, I had craved my father's respect. I thought the red wax seal was his final admission of my worth. It was not. It was just another assignment. He did not love me enough to protect me. He just found me useful. He handed me a loaded gun and told me to clean up the mess he was too afraid to face. Thorne picked up his glass and drained the rest of the bourbon. "I suggest you leave before the maitre d' notices you are loitering." He did not look at me again. He opened his leather binder, returning to his paperwork, dismissing me entirely. I reached out and pulled the burner phone out from under the linen napkin. I slipped it into my wet coat pocket. I gathered my printed terminal logs and stood up from the booth. "Look at the Cayman leases," Thorne said without looking up from his reading. I paused. "Look at the Cayman leases," he repeated, his tone flat and conversational as if he were ordering a side dish. "That is where the current weather patterns are shifting." I turned and walked away from the table. I moved through the crowded dining room past the laughing executives and the clinking champagne glasses, pushing through the heavy brass doors back out into the freezing Seattle storm. The valet lines were busy, the headlights reflecting off the dark pavement. I stood in the rain, clutching the cheap plastic phone in my pocket. I had my confirmation. The fleet was gone, and my father had intentionally drafted me into a war he was too weak to fight himself. I had no family left. I had no allies inside the corporate tower. I was entirely on my own. I pulled my coat tight against the wind. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. If they wanted me to be the executioner, I would gladly swing the axe. I needed to find a dry place, open my laptop, and figure out exactly what was hiding in the Cayman Islands. I returned to my Ballard apartment soaked to the bone. The heating unit in my living room clicked and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the damp Seattle weather. I threw my ruined coat over a wooden dining chair and sat down at the small kitchen table. The heavy Panasonic Toughbook sat exactly where I left it, the rugged screen asleep, but the internal processor humming a low, steady note. I pulled the black plastic burner phone from my pocket. Marcus Thorne had given me a lifeline, but I knew better than to connect the device directly to my home internet network. James possessed the financial resources to hire private security firms capable of monitoring my local service provider. If his technicians detected me probing the corporate servers from my personal residential address, they would send local law enforcement to my door under the pretense of a severe cybersecurity breach. I needed an untraceable bridge. I found a spare data cable in my desk drawer, stripped the plastic casing, and tethered the prepaid mobile phone to the rugged vendor terminal. I configured the mobile hotspot to route through a virtual private network, bouncing my digital signal off relay servers in Iceland and Singapore before pinging the Seattle Port Authority databases. I became a ghost entering the machine. During my first few years working in the fluorescent-lit sub-basement, my brother treated my logistics department like a necessary annoyance. He viewed supply chain management as tedious, manual labor, ignoring the complex digital architecture required to make global shipping function. He never realized I personally designed the automated invoice sorting algorithm our accounting division relied upon every single day. I knew every digital side door in the company network because I was the one who installed the locks. I bypassed the primary corporate vendor gateway and dropped into the raw, unedited data logs. I typed the single geographic clue Thorne had given me at the steakhouse: Cayman. The database hesitated. The green cursor blinked, waiting for authentication. Then a cascading wall of text flooded the monitor. Thousands of international invoices, routing numbers, and wire transfer receipts spilled across the screen. I applied a strict date filter, isolating transactions from the past 36 months. The timeline matched perfectly with the story Thorne told me. 3 years ago, the profit margins began to shrink, and my father started looking the other way. I selected the largest outgoing wire transfer and traced the destination routing number across the globe. It led directly to a corporate registry in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The registered entity was named Cobalt Horizon Holdings. I pulled the public articles of incorporation. The names on the founding documents were shielded by proxy lawyers, utilizing local island loopholes, but the corporate structure was a classic offshore vehicle designed for anonymity. I cross-referenced the Cayman registry dates with the missing hull numbers of our 5 flagship freighters. The puzzle pieces snapped together, forming a picture of staggering financial betrayal. 3 years ago, Lawrence Maritime executed a quiet asset liquidation. James sold the Aurora, the Pacific Queen, and the rest of our heavy ocean fleet to Cobalt Horizon Holdings. He sold them for pennies on the dollar, a deliberate undervaluation that stripped the tangible, physical worth from our family business in a matter of days. But commercial shipping companies require actual ships to fulfill their outstanding cargo contracts. The very next day, Lawrence Maritime signed exclusive long-term charter agreements to lease those exact same freighters back from Cobalt Horizon. The new lease rates were astronomical, totaling 4 times the standard market value for vessels of that size. My brother was draining the corporate treasury from the inside. He took the operating capital generated by our legitimate freight contracts and funneled it directly into his offshore shell company, paying himself a fortune disguised as necessary operating expenses. He hid the theft behind fake bunkering fees and phantom maintenance schedules. My father had watched him do it, choosing comfortable silence over a public scandal. I sat back in my hard wooden chair, rubbing my burning eyes. The $50 million empire James inherited this morning was an illusion. He was the new chief executive of a hollow entity bled dry by his own unyielding greed. But as I stared at the descending ledger balances, something did not add up. If James was successfully funneling millions into his untouchable offshore account, why was he so desperate to force my signature on a legal waiver in the boardroom? Why did he react with such unbridled panic when I revealed the sealed trust document? A thief who had already secured the money would just walk away and let the empty company collapse under its own weight. He was trapped. I leaned forward, bringing my face inches from the glowing monitor. I dug deeper into the Cobalt Horizon financial statements, hunting for the anchor dragging him down. I accessed the International Collateral Registry. James had not just used the Cayman Shell Company to hoard stolen cash. He had utilized our physical fleet to secure risky external financing. The ledger showed a sudden influx of capital originating from a private equity group registered in Macau. It was not a traditional banking institution subject to federal oversight. The lending entity was an overseas shadow syndicate known for predatory interest rates and unforgiving debt collection methods. They provided mezzanine financing to desperate executives functioning in the dark corners of global commerce. My brother had leveraged our mother's ships to fund a disastrous side venture, and he had lost the money. I pulled up the amortization schedule for the Macau loan. The legal contract included a strict default clause. The shadow syndicate held a direct primary lien on all 5 freighters. If the borrower failed to meet the repayment terms, the lender retained the right to seize the physical assets, immediately liquidating the ships to recoup their lost capital. I scrolled to the final page of the loan agreement, locating the specific payment timetable. My blood turned to ice water. A final balloon payment of $15 million was due to the syndicate. I checked the digital timestamp embedded in the contract language. The funds were required to clear the international wire system by Friday at 5 o'clock Pacific time. I glanced at the digital clock glowing in the bottom corner of my screen. 72 hours. If that $15 million did not land in the Macau account in exactly 3 days, the syndicate would send armed recovery teams to the Seattle docks. They would chain the ships, lock the cargo holds, and dismantle Lawrence Maritime down to the bolts. The horrifying truth of my inheritance crystallized in the cold apartment air. The wax-sealed letter resting in my pocket was not a key to a prosperous kingdom. It was a deed to a burning building. My father had not just left me a mess to clean up. He had strapped me to a ticking financial bomb and handed the detonator to a ruthless overseas syndicate. I was fighting a war for an empty, heavily indebted shell on the brink of total collapse. I had to force James into a corner. I needed to confront him with the Cayman audit and demand he surrender his remaining liquid assets to cover the impending debt. Before I could formulate a strategic plan, the burner phone resting on the table vibrated. A single, short buzz shattered the quiet of the kitchen. I stared at the cheap plastic device. Only Marcus Thorne knew that specific phone number. I reached out and tapped the illuminated screen. It was an encrypted text message containing a street address for an upscale cafe in Bellevue and a short, precise sentence. I know you were looking at the Cayman files, Adelaide. Meet me in 1 hour, where the federal authorities receive the evidence proving you stole the ships. The sender was not my brother. It was his wife, Victoria. Bellevue is a city of polished glass and pristine landscaping. It sits across Lake Washington from Seattle, a sanctuary for tech billionaires and generational wealth. I drove across the floating bridge, the morning fog clinging to the dark water. I had spent the last 8 hours dissecting the Cobalt Horizon ledgers, confirming the impending 72-hour deadline from the Macau syndicate. Now, I was heading into enemy territory. Victoria always played a specific role at our family gatherings. She wore pastel cashmere, smiled at appropriate intervals, and nodded while my brother talked over her. She curated a flawless social media presence filled with charity galas and purebred spaniels. I always assumed she was a passive beneficiary of the Lawrence fortune. I viewed her as a vapid socialite, happy to spend the money James brought home, while remaining willfully ignorant of how he acquired it. I was about to learn how dangerously wrong I had been. I parked my old sedan down the street from the address provided in her text message. It was an artisan coffee roaster with minimalist decor and sleek concrete tables. The morning rush had faded, leaving the space mostly empty. The air smelled of roasted beans and expensive perfume. I spotted Victoria sitting in a corner booth near the back. She wore a sharp, tailored trench coat, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot. She did not look like a panicked housewife. She looked like a corporate assassin. I walked over and slid into the chair opposite her. I did not order anything. My bank accounts were still frozen, and I refused to let her buy me a cup of coffee. Victoria took a slow sip of her latte. Her manicured nails tapped against the ceramic mug, producing a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound. "James is a fool," Victoria began her voice, devoid of the sugary inflection she used around my father. "He walked into that boardroom yesterday believing he had secured our future. When you pulled out that red wax seal, he crumbled. He came home last night sweating and shaking, pouring scotch like it was water. He told me you knew about the missing ships. He told you I asked, keeping my posture rigid." "He told me because he had to," Victoria replied, leaning forward across the table. "My husband could not orchestrate a complex international asset transfer if his life depended on it. He lacks the vision. He lacks the stomach. James is an excellent front man for Adelaide. He wears the expensive suits and shakes the right hands at the country club, but he does not build empires. I do." I stared at her. The truth clicked into place, aligning perfectly with the digital breadcrumbs I had uncovered in my apartment. The meticulous layering of the Cayman Shell Company, the proxy lawyers, the hidden routing numbers. It was too elegant for my brother. It bore the signature of someone colder, someone calculating. Victoria was not the accessory to the crime. She was the architect. "You brokered the Macau syndicate loan." I stated the words, tasting like copper in my mouth. "You leveraged my mother's fleet to secure shadow financing." Victoria smiled a thin, razor-sharp expression that did not reach her eyes. "We needed capital to diversify. The shipping industry is a dinosaur. I moved the funds into emerging tech markets. The investments just did not mature in time. Now we have a $15 million gap and a rapidly closing window before the collectors arrive at the docks. And you think I will help you pay it? I said, gripping the edge of the concrete table. I am going to enforce the lien. I am taking the company back. Victoria did not flinch. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a silver iPad. She unlocked the screen and slid it across the smooth surface, stopping it right in front of me. "You are not taking anything," she said. I looked down at the glowing tablet. The screen displayed a meticulously constructed timeline. It was a comprehensive digital dossier. It contained hundreds of fabricated emails, forged vendor invoices, and manipulated server logs. Every document pointed to a single narrative. The dossier painted me as the sole mastermind behind Cobalt Horizon. It showed my personal auditor credentials, authorizing the transfer of the 5 freighters. It linked my specific department to the Macau syndicate communications. "You were the supply chain auditor," Victoria explained, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "You had the security clearance. You knew the vendor protocols better than anyone else in the building. Who would a federal judge believe in a court of law? The wealthy executive who trusted his sister, or the bitter, overlooked basement employee who hacked the system to steal the family fortune out of pure spite?" My hands turned cold. The forgery was flawless. She had weaponized my own digital footprint against me, twisting my years of hard work into a weapon of self-destruction. She understood the internal routing systems well enough to mimic my electronic signature. "You cannot prove this," I said, though my voice lacked its usual conviction. "I do not have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt," Victoria countered, resting her chin on her folded hands. "I just have to hand this tablet to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal indictment alone will ruin you. They will lock you in a holding cell while they spend 3 years unraveling the complicated code. Your life will end the moment I make the phone call. You will never see the outside of a courtroom again." I looked from the screen to her face. She was not bluffing. She had backed herself into a corner with the Macau syndicate, and she was willing to destroy my entire existence to buy herself time. She needed the company assets unfrozen to negotiate with the creditors, and my trust document was standing in her way. She reached across the table and took the iPad back, sliding it safely into her tote bag. "Here's how this plays out, Adelaide. You have 24 hours. You will go home. You will place that 1996 trust document into your fireplace, and you will burn it. You will formally resign from Lawrence Maritime and walk away from the Seattle port forever. If you comply, I delete the dossier. James and I will find a way to stall the syndicate and handle the debt. If you refuse, I make the call to the authorities." She was giving me an ultimatum. Relinquish my mother's legacy or face a manufactured federal prison sentence. I sat back in my chair, matching her cold stare. "You are asking me to surrender to a thief. I am telling you to survive," Victoria corrected, her tone hardening. "Do not let your pride put you behind bars. Your father knew you were too stubborn for your own good. That is why he left you in the basement." Victoria stood up, adjusting the belt of her trench coat. She tossed a crisp $20 bill onto the table to cover her coffee. 24 hours, she repeated, looking down at me. "Choose wisely." She turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the glass door chiming a cheerful note. I watched her cross the street and climb into a sleek black SUV. I sat alone in the quiet shop, my pulse pounding a frantic rhythm in my ears. Victoria thought she had boxed me into an inescapable corner, relying on a fabricated digital trail to secure my surrender. She believed her electronic dossier was an invincible shield. But digital trails can be contested with physical evidence. A forged email means nothing if the raw physical cargo manifests contradict the data. I needed tangible proof that Cobalt Horizon belonged to her. I needed the original shipping container logs, the actual paper documents signed by the dockmasters before the cargo was loaded onto the leased freighters. Those documents were not stored on a cloud server. They were kept in the secured lockboxes down at the waterfront. If I wanted to beat Victoria and clear my name, I had to acquire that physical evidence tonight. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I had to go to Pier 46. I left the Bellevue Cafe with Victoria's 24-hour deadline echoing in my mind. The digital dossier she presented was a masterpiece of corporate framing designed to secure my immediate imprisonment if I refused to surrender my mother's trust document. Victoria believed the electronic records were unassailable, but my decade in the sub-basements of Lawrence Maritime had taught me a fundamental truth about global shipping. Digital ledgers can be manipulated by anyone with the right clearance, but physical cargo manifests require human signatures. A forged email could never alter the ink on a bill of lading signed by a Seattle dockmaster before a shipping container swung over the dark water of Puget Sound. I drove back across the floating bridge, pointing my sedan toward the industrial heart of the Seattle waterfront. Pier 46 was a sprawling expanse of concrete, steel, and floodlights. It operated 24 hours a day, a vital artery pumping goods into the Pacific Northwest. If Cobalt Horizon existed outside the digital realm, its shadow would be cast here. I needed to photograph the physical logbooks, verifying the actual movement of the leased freighters to prove my brother and sister-in-law were the true architects of the fraud. The rain intensified as night fell over the city. I parked a half-mile away from the main security checkpoint, pulling my coat tight against the bitter wind. I knew the layout of the port better than the private contractors hired to guard it. For years, I had walked these docks, conducting routine physical audits of our supply chain, verifying cargo weights against the digital invoices. I bypassed the brightly lit entrance, slipping through a chain-link maintenance gate that had possessed a broken latch since 2018. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water hit me immediately familiar and grounding. The pier was a maze of stacked shipping containers towering 4 stories high, creating narrow metal canyons bathed in the eerie yellow glow of sodium vapor lamps. The heavy machinery groaned in the distance as massive gantry cranes hoisted cargo onto waiting vessels. I navigated the labyrinth, heading toward the central dispatch office, a reinforced steel trailer sitting near the edge of the deepwater berth. That trailer housed the master hard copies of every manifest cleared through Lawrence Maritime. I needed 10 minutes inside. I checked my surroundings and approached the metal stairs. The dispatch office was dark, its windows reinforced with wire mesh. I pulled a small tension wrench and a standard pick from my pocket tools I had carried since my early days verifying locked holding facilities. The lock clicked open with a satisfying metallic snap. I slipped inside and eased the door shut behind me. The air inside the trailer smelled of stale coffee and carbon paper. I turned on a small pen light, holding the beam low. Rows of heavy steel filing cabinets lined the walls. I moved to the section labeled with the current year, my fingers tracing the manila folders until I found the records for the Aurora and the Pacific Queen. I pulled the folders and spread them across the metal desk. The physical manifest told a vastly different story than Victoria's fabricated digital dossier. The signatures on the outbound cargo approvals did not belong to me. They belonged to regional directors who reported directly to James. The routing protocols clearly listed Cobalt Horizon Holdings as the primary lessee, confirming the fraudulent offshore structure. I pulled my phone from my pocket and began photographing every page, capturing the ink signatures, the dates, and the official Port Authority stamps. This was the tangible proof I needed to destroy the fake FBI dossier. Victoria had built her entire blackmail strategy on digital manipulation, but she forgot that ships do not move without paper. I snapped the final photo and slid the folders back into the cabinet. I turned off my pen light, pushing the dispatch door open to slip back into the rain. Well, look who decided to work the late shift. I froze. 2 men stood at the bottom of the metal stairs, blocking my only exit. They did not wear the standard high-visibility vests of the Port Authority. They wore black tactical gear, their faces partially obscured by the shadows and the driving rain. Private security contractors. Victoria had not just threatened me at the cafe. She had anticipated my next move and deployed mercenaries to intercept me. "Hand over the phone, Adelaide," the taller man said, his voice rough, carrying easily over the sound of the storm. "And the envelope in your jacket. We know you carry it everywhere. Do not make this complicated." I gripped the railing, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had the photographic evidence to clear my name and the trust document to seize the company, but I was cornered by two armed professionals on a deserted section of the pier. "I do not have authorization to hand over internal port documents," I replied, trying to inject my voice with the cold authority I used during audits. "Step aside. You are trespassing on a restricted commercial berth." The second man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped onto the bottom stair, unholstering a heavy black baton. "We do not work for the port lady. We work for the executive suite. Now give us the phone or we break your arm and take it." They began moving up the metal stairs, their boots echoing loudly. I backed toward the heavy steel door of the dispatch trailer, realizing I had nowhere to run. I was trapped. A loud mechanical groan suddenly erupted from the darkness above us. The two contractors stopped looking up into the rain. I followed their gaze. Towering over the dispatch trailer, casting a massive shadow in the sodium lights, was a heavy-duty container crane. The operator cabin sat 90 feet in the air, seemingly empty just moments before. But now the warning beacons were flashing bright amber against the night sky. The whine of the hydraulic motors intensified. A massive 40-foot steel shipping container, painted a dull rust red, swung out of the darkness suspended by thick steel cables. It hovered directly above the two security contractors. The crane operator did not sound a warning horn. He simply released the locking mechanism. The multi-ton shipping crate plummeted from the sky. It hit the concrete pier with a deafening tectonic crash, shaking the ground beneath my feet. The impact sent a shockwave of displaced rainwater and grit exploding outward. The steel box landed precisely between the bottom of the dispatch stairs and the two mercenaries, instantly severing their path to me. The contractors scrambled backward, shouting over the noise, raising their arms to shield their faces from the spray. I did not wait to see their reaction. The falling container had created a solid steel wall, blocking their line of sight. I bolted down the stairs, turning in the opposite direction, sprinting into the narrow alleys formed by the stacked cargo crates. I ran until my lungs burned, the sound of the rain drowning out any pursuit. I rounded a corner near the edge of the pier, leaning against a cold metal container trying to catch my breath. I looked back up at the towering gantry crane. The operator cabin door swung open. A man stepped out onto the narrow metal catwalk, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. It was Hank. I had known Hank since I was a child. He was a grizzled dockmaster with a gray beard and a quiet demeanor who had worked the Seattle waterfront for 40 years. He remembered my mother. He remembered the woman who actually bought the ships before my father took the credit. Hank had always treated me with a quiet, respectful distance, never participating in the corporate games played in the downtown tower. Hank looked down at me from the catwalk, his face illuminated by the amber warning lights. He did not wave. He did not shout. He simply raised 2 fingers to the brim of his hard hat, a silent salute acknowledging the shift in power. I nodded back, my chest heaving. The unexpected intervention had given me the split-second window I needed. Hank had just risked his pension and his freedom to protect the daughter of the woman who built the port. I turned and slipped through the chain-link gate, disappearing into the Seattle night. I had the physical cargo manifests safely secured on my phone, providing the definitive proof required to dismantle Victoria's fabricated digital dossier. I had survived the ambush at Pier 46, but I knew the war was escalating rapidly. The Macau syndicate was demanding their $15 million by Friday, and Victoria was now deploying physical violence to secure the corporate assets. I had the evidence to defend myself, but defense would not save Lawrence Maritime. If I wanted to stop my brother and sister-in-law, I could not wait for them to attack me again in a rigged civil court. I needed to launch a preemptive strike and trigger a controlled demolition of their empire. I had to expose their fraud to the only people who held the power to cut off their financial lifeline instantly. I sat in the driver's seat of my old sedan parked 3 blocks away from the Seattle waterfront. The engine idled, pushing weak, unsteady heat through the dashboard vents. My hands shook as I held my phone, the screen glowing bright in the dark cabin. I swiped through the high-resolution photographs I had just taken inside the secured dispatch trailer. The crisp, dark ink signatures of the regional directors stared back at me, confirming the transfer of the freighters to Cobalt Horizon Holdings. The physical evidence was undeniable. I had acquired the exact proof required to dismantle Victoria and her fabricated federal dossier. I had the ammunition to clear my name. But as I stared at the rain streaking across my windshield, a cold realization settled deep into my bones. Mere survival was no longer enough. If I took these photographs to a federal judge tomorrow morning, it would trigger a sprawling corporate investigation. The authorities would issue injunctions, freeze the remaining corporate accounts, subpoena the regional directors, and launch a forensic audit that could easily take 3 years to conclude. Victoria would immediately retaliate by releasing her fake electronic trail, framing me for the embezzlement. We would find ourselves locked in a bitter legal stalemate, fighting over a frozen empire while our lawyers drained whatever capital remained. And while the attorneys argued in pristine courtrooms, the Macau syndicate would descend upon the docks. The shadow lenders did not care about pending civil litigation. They did not honor court injunctions or respect the slow-turning wheels of the American justice system. They cared only about their $15 million. I could not defeat my brother and sister-in-law in a rigged legal arena. The justice system was too slow, too easily manipulated by billionaires with endless retainers. I had to step outside the bounds of the courtroom. I had to weaponize their own enemies against them. I pulled the rugged Panasonic vendor terminal from the passenger seat and rested it on my steering wheel. I tethered the burner phone, reestablishing my secure, encrypted connection to the offshore network. During my decade spent verifying international freight contracts, I learned exactly how shadow banking institutions functioned. They operated in the dark spaces between legitimate commerce and organized crime, hiding behind layered shell companies and complex proxy trusts. But they still had to interact with the physical world to track their multi-million-dollar collateral. I cross-referenced the Cayman routing numbers from Victoria's offshore accounts with the specific cargo manifests I had photographed. I hunted for the hidden digital thread connecting Cobalt Horizon to the Macau lenders. I found the connection buried deep within a series of priority maritime insurance policies. Ocean freighters require premium underwriting to legally enter foreign ports. The insurance beneficiary for our 5 ships had been quietly altered. The new primary lien holder was an entity named Red Dragon Capital. I breached the secondary communications servers monitoring the inbound messages routed to the executive suite of Lawrence Maritime. James had received 6 urgent notices from Red Dragon Capital within the last 48 hours. The correspondence lacked the polite, deferential phrasing of traditional banking executives. The messages were stark, clinical, and terrifying. The syndicate was already keenly aware of the impending corporate insolvency. They possessed independent analysts who monitored global shipping revenues. They knew James did not have the liquid cash required to cover the exorbitant balloon payment on Friday. And they were not waiting patiently for the deadline to expire. I deciphered the final encrypted transmission sent to my brother just an hour ago. Asset recovery protocols initiated, advanced teams deployed to Seattle sector, port lockdown imminent. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold. The syndicate was moving private repossession teams into the city tonight. They planned to seize the freighters by force, blockading the deepwater berths and stripping the physical assets right off the docks. They were going to board the vessels, expel the crews, and chain the engines. The physical danger was escalating rapidly, spiraling far beyond corporate fraud. James and Victoria were losing control of their own criminal operation. Their arrogant offshore maneuvering had summoned a ruthless predator they lacked the strength to contain. If the repo teams locked down the port, the fallout would destroy the shipping infrastructure of the entire city. Thousands of dock workers, men like Hank, who had spent their entire lives on the waterfront, would lose their jobs. Supply chains would fracture, causing sweeping economic damage across the Pacific Northwest. The legacy my mother built, the very fleet she fought to acquire, would be torn apart and sold for scrap metal in foreign salvage yards. Victoria thought she was playing a highly sophisticated game of chess, holding her fake dossier over my head. She believed she held all the cards. She did not realize she was standing on the train tracks, holding up a paper shield against an oncoming locomotive. Her blackmail threat meant nothing if the ships were seized before sunrise. I closed the heavy laptop. I could not fight armed mercenaries on the docks. I could not rely on the local police to untangle a complex international fraud scheme in 24 hours. I had to execute a surgical strike. I had to trigger a controlled demolition of James and his corporate credibility before Victoria could make her move. I needed to cut off their financial lifeline instantly, leaving them defenseless and isolated against the wrath of the syndicate. I picked up my phone and accessed the public relations calendar for Lawrence Maritime. My brother was scheduled to make a highly publicized appearance tonight. The Seattle Maritime Association annual gala was currently underway at a luxury hotel in the center of the downtown financial district. It was the premier networking event for the Pacific Northwest shipping industry, drawing the wealthiest investors, politicians, and logistics magnates in the state. James was the scheduled keynote speaker. I knew exactly why he was standing on that illuminated stage tonight. He was desperately pitching the Leadport investors, attempting to secure a last-minute bridge loan to cover the $15 million syndicate debt. He was using the prestige of our family name, the pristine reputation my father spent 30 years cultivating, to beg for a quiet bailout. He would smile, wear his bespoke tuxedo, and promise them massive returns on their capital. If he secured that funding, he would pay off the Macau lenders, validate Victoria, and seal his theft of the company forever. He would win. I could not let him finish that speech. If I handed the physical manifest to the authorities, Victoria would fulfill her promise and destroy my life. But if I handed the irrefutable evidence directly to the billionaire investors sitting in that ballroom tonight, I would destroy James. Rich men protect their capital fiercely. They do not tolerate risk, and they certainly do not tolerate being defrauded by desperate executives. If I exposed the Cayman Shell Company and the hidden Macau debt to the exact men holding his purse strings, they would not just decline his loan, they would sever him from the financial community forever. I put the sedan in gear and pulled away from the dark industrial waterfront, pointing my car toward the glowing skyline of downtown Seattle. I was going to crash the gala. I was soaked in rainwater, my hair was tangled, and I was driving a car with a rattling heater. But I was carrying the firepower to bring down a billionaire. I needed the right armor for a high society execution. I stopped at a red light, reached into my glove compartment, and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside rested my mother's vintage pearl necklace, the only physical heirloom I possessed. My father had tried to lock it away, but I had taken it the day she died. I fastened the cold pearls around my neck, feeling the weight of the stones against my collarbone. The executioner was on her way. I parked my damp sedan in a public parking garage 3 blocks from the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The rain had plastered my hair to my cheeks, but I did not care. On the passenger seat sat a stack of 20 glossy black folders. I had spent the last hour at an all-night print shop compiling the digital Cayman audit alongside the high-resolution photographs of the physical cargo manifests. I bound them with heavy covers. They looked like professional prospectus reports. They were actually warrants for corporate execution. I reached up and touched the cool vintage pearls resting against my collarbone. My mother wore this exact necklace the night she finalized the purchase of our first 3 freighters. My father had tried to lock the jewelry away in a safe deposit box after she passed, claiming it was a corporate asset. I took it the day of her funeral and never gave it back. I bypassed the main red carpet entrance. I knew the service corridors of the Fairmont because I had audited the catering logistics for this exact event 5 years ago. I slipped through the kitchen prep area, blending in with the chaos of the waitstaff carrying silver trays. I pushed through the heavy, padded double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over 60 round tables draped in crisp white linen. Waiters poured champagne into tall flutes. The room was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer evening gowns. This was the epicenter of Pacific Northwest wealth. For my entire childhood, my father had brought James to these galas, parading him around the room, introducing him to governors and banking magnates. I was always left at home, or ordered to remain in the basement office to finalize the quarterly compliance reports. I was never invited to the ballroom. Tonight, I invited myself. I scanned the room. Victoria sat at the primary VIP table near the front. She wore an emerald green silk dress, holding a flute of champagne, maintaining her flawless socialite posture. But her knuckles were white where she gripped the fragile glass. She knew the Macau syndicate deadline was ticking. She knew they needed a financial lifeline tonight. On the illuminated stage, James stood behind a clear acrylic podium. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo. A giant projection screen behind him displayed the Lawrence Maritime logo. He was in the middle of his keynote address, projecting the illusion of invincible success. "We are entering a new era of global logistics," James announced, his voice booming through the sophisticated sound system. "Lawrence Maritime is expanding our fleet, modernizing our Pacific routes, and preparing for unprecedented growth. We are offering an exclusive short-term bridge investment opportunity to our oldest partners. A $15 million tranche yielding extraordinary returns within the fiscal quarter." He was begging. He dressed it up in the language of high finance, but he was begging the room for the exact amount required to pay off the shadow lenders. If he secured that bridge loan, he would pay the syndicate, dissolve the offshore shell, and secure his theft forever. I did not march to the stage. I did not shout or throw a tantrum. I moved like a ghost through the dim aisles separating the tables. I bypassed the mid-level executives and headed straight for the front row. I knew exactly who held the purse strings in this room. I stopped at the table of Richard Sterling, the chairman of the Pacific Port Authority. He controlled the largest commercial credit lines in the state. I slid one of the heavy black folders onto the white tablecloth, resting it right next to his dinner plate. I did not say a word. I just moved to the next table. I dropped a folder in front of the Chief Risk Officer for Washington Mutual. I placed another in front of the primary underwriter for Global Maritime Insurance. I distributed all 20 folders to the most powerful financiers in Seattle, forming a tight circle of damning evidence right at the foot of the stage. Sterling frowned at the unmarked black folder. He picked up his reading glasses and slipped them on. He flipped the heavy cover open. I stood in the shadows near the exit doors, watching his face. Inside the folder, Sterling saw the Cayman Islands Offshore Registry. He saw the name Cobalt Horizon Holdings. He turned the page and saw the crisp photographs of the physical cargo manifests signed by my brother's regional directors. He saw the irrefutable proof that Lawrence Maritime did not own the ships James was currently bragging about. The final page contained the intercepted communication from the Macau Shadow Syndicate outlining the impending asset seizure. Around the front row, other executives opened their folders. The polite murmuring of the ballroom died away, replaced by the sharp rustle of thick paper turning. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. James was still talking, oblivious to the silent detonation occurring right beneath him. "Our commitment to transparency and steady growth remains our highest priority," James said, gripping the edges of the podium. Sterling closed the black folder. He did not look angry. He looked disgusted. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape that echoed across the quiet ballroom. "James, pause for a moment," Sterling said, his voice projecting without a microphone. James stopped speaking. He blinked, shading his eyes against the stage spotlights, trying to see into the crowd. "Richard, is there a question regarding the investment prospectus?" "There is no investment prospectus," James Sterling replied, holding up the black folder. "There is only a Cayman shell company and a fraudulent ledger. You do not own the Aurora. You do not own the Pacific Queen. You are standing on that stage attempting to solicit $15 million from this room to pay off an offshore shadow syndicate before they seize the docks tomorrow morning." The silence in the ballroom became deafening. James opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the folder in Sterling's hand, then looked down at the front row. Every major investor was holding the exact same packet. The color drained from my brother's face, leaving him looking sick and hollow. "The Port Authority formally revokes your line of credit effective immediately," Sterling announced, turning his back on the stage. "We will not fund your criminal negligence." At the VIP table, Victoria dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the floor. She spun around, her eyes scanning the dark edges of the ballroom, searching for the source of the folders. Her gaze locked onto mine. I stood near the exit, the vintage pearls glowing softly against my collarbone. I did not smile. I simply held her gaze, letting her realize that her fabricated digital dossier was now worthless. She could not frame me for embezzling a company that the entire Seattle financial district now knew her husband had ruined. I had executed a flawless, bloodless assassination of their corporate credibility. I pushed through the padded double doors, leaving the chaos of the ballroom behind me. I walked back out into the cold Seattle night, breathing the sharp air. I had severed their financial lifeline. James would not get the bridge loan. The syndicate would not get paid. But as I walked toward my car, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I had cornered a predator. Victoria was stripped of her leverage and out of time. She was no longer trying to win a corporate boardroom battle. She was fighting for her freedom. And I knew she would not hesitate to use lethal force to eliminate the only piece of evidence that could still hang her. The wax-sealed trust document resting in my pocket was the last target on her list, and she knew exactly where I lived. I drove away from the downtown financial district, the glow of the Fairmont Olympic fading in my rearview mirror. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the ballroom was rapidly converting into a cold, metallic dread. I had detonated James's corporate credibility in front of the most powerful men in Seattle. He was financially isolated and publicly humiliated, but I had not defeated Victoria. I had only forced her hand. Victoria was a survivor in the most ruthless sense of the word. She had not married my brother for love. She had married into an empire, and when that empire began to crumble, she had orchestrated the offshore shell company to protect her own interests. Now stripped of her fabricated digital leverage and facing the immediate wrath of the Macau syndicate, she was trapped. Cornered predators do not surrender. They attack the single vulnerability keeping them from escape. The 1996 trust document resting in my pocket was the only tangible proof that my mother owned the fleet. Without it, my claim vanished, and Victoria could easily spin the gala disaster as a misunderstanding, allowing her to negotiate with the shadow lenders unhindered. She needed that paper destroyed before the emergency injunction hearing tomorrow morning, and I knew she would not send my brother to do it. James lacked the nerve for physical confrontation. Victoria would hire a professional. I did not return to my Ballard apartment. It was too predictable, too exposed. Instead, I parked my sedan in a dimly lit municipal lot 3 miles away, near the shipping canal. I turned off the engine, letting the cold silence of the car envelop me. During my time in the sub-basements, I had learned a great deal about the dark economy that functioned alongside global logistics. There were individuals who specialized in corporate espionage fixers, who acquired sensitive competitor data or destroyed compromising hard drives for a premium fee. They were ghosts, moving without digital footprints, executing their tasks with terrifying efficiency. If Victoria needed a document incinerated, she had the offshore capital to hire the very best. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a secondary burner phone, a cheap device I had purchased earlier that afternoon specifically for this night. I activated the screen and opened a secure streaming application. The video feed buffered for a second before displaying the interior of my apartment. I had anticipated retaliation the moment I left the Bellevue Cafe. Before heading to the docks to photograph the manifests, I had stopped at an electronics store and purchased a high-definition wireless surveillance camera. I concealed the lens inside the hollowed-out spine of an old accounting textbook, resting on a high bookshelf, offering a clear, unobstructed view of my entire living room and kitchen. I sat in the dark car watching the silent video feed on my small screen. My apartment looked exactly as I had left it. The worn sofa, the small dining table, the shadows stretching across the cheap laminate flooring. The minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour, the tension in my neck coiled tight, aching with the anticipation of violence. At precisely 2 a.m, the deadbolt on my apartment door clicked. It was not a forced entry. There was no splintering wood or shattered glass. The lock simply turned smoothly, expertly manipulated. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside, moving with absolute fluid silence. The operative wore dark, non-reflective clothing and thin, tactical gloves. A black balaclava obscured their features, leaving only their eyes visible in the ambient light filtering through the window blinds. My breath caught in my throat. Watching a stranger invade your sanctuary, even through a screen, is a deeply violating experience. The professional did not hesitate or stumble in the dark. They swept the room with a small, focused penlight, instantly assessing the layout. They ignored the television, the laptop on the table, and the small jewelry box in the bedroom. They were not a burglar looking for pawnable assets. They were a corporate cleaner hunting for a specific target. I watched as the operative moved methodically across the floor, testing the floorboards with calculated steps. They reached the center of the living room, pausing over a specific section of laminate. They knelt, retrieved a flat pry bar from their tactical vest, and smoothly lifted a loose floorboard. I had discovered that hidden cavity shortly after moving in and had used it to store emergency cash. Tonight, it held the bait. The cleaner reached into the dark space and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Even on the small screen, the dark red wax seal was clearly visible. The operative stood up, holding the envelope. They did not open it to verify the contents. Professionals do not care about the text. They care about completing the objective. The cleaner walked directly into my small kitchen, retrieving a long metal lighter from their vest. They held the envelope over the stainless steel sink and flicked the ignition. A bright orange flame illuminated the dark kitchen. The fire caught the edge of the heavy paper, spreading rapidly. The wax seal melted, dripping into the basin. The operative watched calmly as the document curled and blackened, ensuring the destruction was total. When the fire threatened their gloved fingers, they dropped the burning remains into the sink, turning on the faucet for 2 seconds to extinguish the final embers. The mission was complete. The evidence was destroyed. The cleaner turned, exited the apartment, and locked the door behind them, leaving no trace of their presence, save for the wet ashes in the sink. I sat in my freezing car, the glow of the phone screen reflecting in my eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm of sheer terror and exhilarating relief. The professionalism of the hit was chilling. Victoria had escalated the conflict to felony breaking and entering, demonstrating a ruthless commitment to her survival. If I had been asleep in that apartment, things might have ended very differently. But my countermeasure had worked flawlessly. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the crisp, original 1996 trust document, my thumb brushing the pristine, untouched wax seal. The envelope, currently washing down my kitchen drain, was a carefully crafted decoy. I had spent 20 minutes earlier that evening melting red candle wax onto a heavy envelope containing an old syllabus from my community college accounting class. Victoria believed she had won. She believed the only physical evidence proving my mother owned the fleet was gone. She would walk into the King County Courthouse tomorrow morning for the emergency injunction hearing, radiating arrogant confidence. She would stand before the judge fully expecting to finalize my legal destruction. She did not know I had the real document in my pocket. She did not know I possessed the high-definition security footage of her hired operative committing a major felony. And she certainly did not know I had spent the afternoon hacking the offshore routing numbers, tying that operative's cryptocurrency payment directly back to her personal accounts. The trap was fully set. I had lured the apex predator out of the shadows, and she had taken the bait perfectly. The corporate boardroom maneuvering was over. Tomorrow morning, the battle would move to a federal courtroom, and I was going to drop the guillotine. The King County Courthouse is an imposing structure of gray stone and heavy mahogany doors. It sits in the heart of downtown Seattle, a monument to the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system. I walked through the metal detectors at 8 o'clock in the morning, the cold rain still clinging to my trench coat. My bank accounts were frozen. My access to the corporate tower was revoked, and my brother had just hired a professional operative to break into my home. But as I rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4. The gallery was mostly empty save for a few junior clerks and a court reporter preparing her machine. But the defense table was crowded. James and Victoria sat at the center, flanked by 3 expensive corporate litigators. They looked triumphant. James wore a lighter gray suit today, projecting an image of calm, approachable authority. Victoria sat perfectly upright in a tailored navy dress, her blonde hair immaculate. She caught my eye as I walked down the center aisle and offered a small, pitying smile. It was the smile of a predator who believed the hunt was over. She was absolutely certain that the only physical evidence of my mother's legacy had been reduced to ashes in my kitchen sink. She believed I was walking into a slaughterhouse. I took my seat alone at the plaintiff's table. I had no legal representation. I had a single manila folder resting on the polished wood in front of me. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison took the bench. He was a veteran jurist with tired eyes and a reputation for favoring the established corporate hierarchy. He looked over the thick stack of injunction paperwork James's team had filed, adjusting his reading glasses. We are here for an emergency ex parte injunction regarding the operational control of Lawrence Maritime. Judge Harrison began, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. The petitioner claims the respondent is attempting to execute a fraudulent takeover utilizing forged documents. Let us hear from the petitioner. James stood up, smoothing his tie. He walked confidently to the witness stand, raising his right hand to swear the oath. He did not look at me. He looked directly at the judge, adopting the posture of a weary executive forced to deal with an unstable subordinate. Your Honor. James began, his voice smooth and practiced. My father built Lawrence Maritime from a single tugboat into a Pacific powerhouse. Upon his passing, I assumed control to ensure the stability of the company and the livelihood of our thousands of employees. And the respondent, Judge Harrison, prompted, looking over his glasses. Your sister. Adelaide was a mid-level supply chain auditor, James said, injecting a note of practiced sorrow into his tone. She has struggled for years with the reality of her position within the company hierarchy. When the will was read and she realized my father had entrusted the executive suite to me, she became irrational. She produced a piece of parchment claiming my mother owned our fleet through a secret trust. Is there any validity to this claim, the judge asked? None, Your Honor, James replied firmly, gripping the edge of the witness stand. Lawrence Maritime owns its fleet outright. We are in perfect financial health. The document she produced is a complete fabrication. She utilized her internal access to our logistics department to forge shipping codes and create a fictional narrative. I sat at the plaintiff's table, keeping my posture rigid. I did not object. I did not interrupt. I listened as my brother systematically dismantled my reputation under oath. Every word he spoke was a calculated lie, designed to secure the injunction and strip me of any legal standing. The defense counsel, a sharp-featured man named Sterling, stood up. "Mr. Lawrence, can you speak to the allegations regarding offshore accounts? The respondent has previously claimed you transferred assets to the Cayman Islands." James laughed softly, a rich, dismissive sound. "It is an absurd accusation. Lawrence Maritime operates exclusively within the jurisdiction of the United States. I have no knowledge of any Cayman shell companies. We do not utilize offshore tax havens. It is a desperate attempt by a disgruntled employee to smear my administration." Sterling nodded, pacing in front of the witness box. "And this alleged trust document, the one proving her claim, where is it now?" "I assume she destroyed it," James said, turning his gaze toward me for the first time, his eyes glittering with malicious confidence. "When she realized our legal team would demand a forensic analysis of the ink and the paper, she panicked. I challenge her to produce this so-called letter today. She cannot, because it never existed." The courtroom was silent, save for the rapid clicking of the court reporter's machine. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The judge was clearly leaning toward James's polished narrative. A wealthy CEO defending his company against a bitter sibling was a story the court understood and frequently endorsed. I remained perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. I needed his testimony to conclude. I needed his perjury to be absolute, irreversible, and officially entered into the public record. "Does the respondent wish to cross-examine the witness?" Judge Harrison asked, looking down at me with mild annoyance. "Or produce the document in question?" I stood up. I picked up my manila folder and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. I did not look at Victoria. I looked directly at my brother. "Mr. Lawrence," I began, my voice ringing clear and cold in the large room. "You just testified under oath that Lawrence Maritime is in perfect financial health. You testified that you have no knowledge of any Cayman shell companies. And you testified that my mother's trust document is a forgery that I cannot produce. Are those statements accurate?" "They are absolutely accurate," James replied, lifting his chin. I turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A." I opened the manila folder. I reached inside and pulled out the crisp, heavy parchment. The dark red wax seal caught the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. It was pristine, untouched by fire or water. I held it up. At the defense table, Victoria gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard, her knuckles turned white. Her flawless, socialite posture collapsed. She stared at the document in my hand, her eyes wide with shock and sudden dawning terror. James physically recoiled on the witness stand. He gripped the wooden railing, stepping back as if the paper were radioactive. The smug confidence evaporated from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. I walked over to the bailiff and handed him the document. "The original 1996 irrevocable trust, Your Honor, signed by my mother and notarized by the state of Washington, establishing her sole ownership of the Lawrence Maritime Fleet." The defense counsel sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We contest the authenticity of that document. The respondent has had days to manufacture a sophisticated forgery." I did not manufacture anything. I countered, turning back to the judge, "But I can demonstrate exactly who specializes in sophisticated forgery and corporate theft. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit B." I reached back into the manila folder and pulled out a digital storage drive. The trap had closed. James had perjured himself, relying on Victoria's hired cleaner to eliminate the evidence. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess. They did not realize I had flipped the board. I stood in the center of the courtroom, the 1996 irrevocable trust document held firmly in my hand. The dark red wax seal remained unbroken, catching the harsh fluorescent lights. The silence in the room was absolute. A vacuum, created by the sudden collapse of my brother's carefully constructed reality. James staggered backward on the witness stand, gripping the wooden railing. He stared at the parchment, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He had built his entire defense, his entire arrogant posture, on the absolute certainty that this specific piece of paper had been incinerated in my kitchen sink. He looked out at the defense table, his eyes wide with frantic confusion, locking onto his wife. Victoria sat frozen in her tailored navy dress. The color had completely vanished from her face, leaving her skin the shade of chalk. Her flawless socialite facade was shattering in real time. She realized the terrible truth before her lawyers even moved. She had sent a professional to destroy my legacy, and she had been outplayed by a decoy. "Objection, Your Honor," Defense Counsel Sterling shouted, finally recovering from the shock. He scrambled to his feet, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is an ambush. We have had no opportunity to authenticate this document. It is highly irregular to submit unverified evidence during an ex parte hearing. It is an ex parte hearing precisely because you attempted to secure an injunction without my presence," I replied, turning my gaze back to Judge Harrison. "You demanded I produce the document under oath. I am producing it. Furthermore, Your Honor, I have additional evidence that directly addresses Mr. Lawrence's earlier testimony regarding his lack of knowledge concerning fraudulent activity." Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. He looked from the trust document in my hand to the panicked expressions at the defense table. His demeanor shifted. The veteran jurist recognized the scent of a collapsing lie. "I will accept Exhibit A pending immediate forensic authentication," the judge stated, his voice sharp and commanding. "What is your additional evidence, Ms. Lawrence?" I reached back into my manila folder and extracted a digital storage drive. I walked slowly toward the clerk, handing her the drive. "I would like to submit Exhibit B," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the gallery. High-definition security footage captured inside my personal residence at 2 o'clock this morning. Sterling was on his feet again. "Objection! Relevance, Your Honor. The relevance, Mr. Sterling, is that your client just testified under oath that I panicked and destroyed this trust document," I countered, cutting him off. "The footage will demonstrate exactly who attempted to destroy the evidence. Play the video." Judge Harrison ordered his tone, brooking no argument. The court clerk inserted the drive into the presentation system. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall flickered to life. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the dark interior of my Ballard apartment appeared on the screen. The timestamp glowed in the corner. We watched the shadow operative breach my front door with terrifying efficiency. We watched the masked cleaner sweep the room, locate the hidden floorboard safe, and extract the decoy envelope. The room collectively held its breath as the operative flicked the lighter and incinerated the heavy parchment in my stainless steel sink. When the video concluded, the silence returned thicker and heavier than before. "That footage proves nothing," James stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. He gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white. "That could be anyone. It could be a stunt you orchestrated to frame me." I turned slowly to face my brother. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The trap was springing shut exactly as I had designed it. "I agree, James," I said evenly. "The operative wore a mask. It is impossible to identify them from the visual evidence alone. However, professionals who execute corporate espionage for hire do not work for free. They require immediate, untraceable compensation." I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a stack of printed ledger pages. "Your Honor, I submit Exhibit C," I announced, handing the pages to the bailiff. "These are digital server logs tracking a substantial cryptocurrency transfer executed simultaneously with the break-in." Sterling lunged forward, grabbing the pages from the bailiff before the judge could review them. He scanned the top sheet, his eyes darting frantically across the complex hexadecimal strings. The transaction utilized an encrypted offshore tumbling service, I explained, addressing the bench. But the origin point of the capital is clearly visible in the raw data. The payment was not authorized by James Lawrence. The funds originated from a private, secure account registered in the Cayman Islands, an account controlled exclusively by Victoria Lawrence. Victoria shot out of her chair. "That is a lie," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, losing all pretense of high society composure. "She hacked my accounts. She manufactured that digital trail to frame me. She is a supply chain auditor. She knows how to manipulate the system." It was the exact threat she had delivered to me at the Bellevue Cafe, thrown back in a frantic attempt at self-preservation. But her timing was disastrous. "Are you suggesting, Miss Lawrence?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register, "that your sister-in-law hired an operative to break into her own home to burn a fake document in her own sink, just so she could hack your personal offshore accounts to frame you for a crime that your husband just testified under oath never occurred?" Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. The sheer, convoluted absurdity of her defense hung in the air, exposing the raw desperation of a trapped criminal. She looked at her defense counsel, but Sterling had stepped away from the table, staring down at the server logs with an expression of profound professional horror. "Order," Judge Harrison bellowed, bringing his heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom descended into chaos. The junior clerks were whispering furiously. James slumped against the witness stand, his face buried in his hands, finally comprehending the totality of his destruction. Victoria stood rigid at the defense table, her chest heaving, staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt physical. She had underestimated me. She had looked at the quiet auditor in the basement and saw a victim. She failed to realize that the person who builds the digital architecture knows exactly how to tear it down. I had outplayed the mastermind at her own game, stripping her of her leverage, her wealth, and her freedom in a span of 15 minutes. But as the gavel continued to fall, echoing through the mahogany chamber, I knew the victory was incomplete. I had successfully severed James and Victoria from the empire. I had proven my mother's ownership. The legal battle was effectively over. However, the true war had not been fought in this courtroom. The Shadow Syndicate did not care about perjury charges or forensic document authentication. They cared about their $15 million, and the deadline was expiring today. I was about to inherit an empire, but if I did not find a mountain of liquid cash before sunset, I would be the CEO of a smoldering ruin. The air in courtroom 4 felt entirely different after the heavy crack of Judge Harrison's gavel. The suffocating arrogance that James and Victoria had carried into the room evaporated, replaced by the stark, sterile reality of the justice system working exactly as designed. The digital ledger logs resting on the bench were not subjective. They were a mathematical execution. "I have seen enough," Judge Harrison stated, his voice stripped of all judicial patience. "The petitioner has utilized this court to perpetuate a massive fraud. Furthermore, the evidence suggests a coordinated conspiracy to destroy critical documents and obstruct justice." The judge turned his attention directly to my brother. The fatigue of the veteran jurist was gone, replaced by cold, professional fury. "Mr. Lawrence, you filed an emergency ex parte injunction under penalty of perjury. You swore an oath and systematically lied to this court regarding the financial architecture of Lawrence Maritime and your knowledge of offshore holdings. You attempted to use the legal system as a weapon against a legitimate stakeholder." James stood paralyzed, leaning heavily against the witness stand. The bespoke gray suit that had looked so formidable 30 minutes ago now seemed too large for him, hanging loosely on his shoulders. He did not attempt to speak. The eloquent CEO persona was dead. Therefore, Judge Harrison continued, his voice rising to ensure the court reporter captured every syllable. I am dismissing the petitioner's injunction immediately with extreme prejudice. But we are not finished. The judge picked up the thick manila folder containing my father's original will, the same document that had started this war less than 48 hours ago. The court has reviewed the estate documents filed by the late Richard Lawrence, Judge Harrison noted, turning to the specific page Marcus Thorne had highlighted for me. Section 8, paragraph 4 outlines a strict fiduciary morality clause. It states that should the primary heir engage in any action constituting active fraud, embezzlement, or conduct detrimental to the foundational assets of the corporation, his inheritance is immediately and irreversibly voided. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in front of me. During my decade in the sub-basement, I had watched James make endless, careless mistakes, confident that our father would always shield him from the consequences. He had never faced a true penalty. Today, the shield was gone. By your own actions, Mr. Lawrence, and by the irrefutable evidence submitted today establishing your complicity in the Cobalt Horizon Shell Company, you have triggered this clause, Judge Harrison declared. I am officially voiding your inheritance. All operating shares, holding companies, and physical assets pertaining to Lawrence Maritime revert entirely to the primary lien holder of the foundational trust. The judge looked directly at me. Adelaide Lawrence. The transition of power was instantaneous. There was no transition period, no executive committee review. I went from an ousted auditor to the sole owner of a $50 million maritime empire with the strike of a gavel. But the judge was not finished. He turned his attention to the defense table, where Victoria sat frozen, her pristine posture shattered. Regarding the security footage and the digital ledger tracking the offshore payment, Judge Harrison set his tone, turning icy. The court finds sufficient probable cause to believe that Victoria Lawrence conspired to commit felony breaking and entering, destruction of evidence, and wire fraud. He looked toward the armed bailiff standing near the heavy wooden doors. Detain Ms. Lawrence for immediate questioning by the Seattle Police Department and notify the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. Victoria finally moved. No, she gasped, scrambling backward, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You cannot do this. I am an executive. This is a misunderstanding. She reached out toward her defense counsel, but Sterling stepped quickly away, distancing himself from the toxic fallout of his clients. The bailiff crossed the courtroom in 3 long strides, securing a firm grip on Victoria's arm. Do not touch me, she shrieked, her voice breaking, losing all the refined elegance she had projected at the Bellevue Cafe. James, do something, tell them. James did not move. He did not look at his wife. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, utterly defeated. The golden boy had fallen, and he had nothing left to say. The bailiff escorted Victoria out of the courtroom, her protests echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the sound. Judge Harrison looked back at James. You are stripped of your executive title, Mr. Lawrence. Your corporate assets are frozen pending a federal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement. You will surrender your passport to the clerk before you leave this building. The judge picked up his gavel. This court grants Adelaide Lawrence total, unencumbered executive control of Lawrence Maritime, effective immediately. We are adjourned. The heavy wooden hammer fell one final time, the sound signaling the end of the legal war. I stood up slowly, gathering my manila folder. I did not look at my brother as I walked down the center aisle. I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the bustling corridor of the courthouse. The Seattle rain was still falling, beating against the high windows, but the air felt lighter. I had won. I had proven. My mother's legacy dismantled the offshore fraud and secured my rightful place. The corporate assassin had been dragged away in handcuffs, and the arrogant CEO was ruined. The victory was absolute, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, stepped out into the damp city streets, and hailed a cab. I gave the driver the address for the Lawrence Maritime Corporate Tower. I needed to sit in the executive office. I needed to feel the weight of the company I had just saved. The cab pulled up to the sleek glass skyscraper. I walked through the revolving doors, bypassing the security desk, holding my head high. The receptionist, who had sneered at me yesterday, quickly looked down at her keyboard, her face pale. News travels fast in a corporate hierarchy. They already knew who owned the building. I rode the executive elevator to the top floor, the doors sliding open to reveal the sprawling suite my father had occupied for 3 decades. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the dark, choppy waters of Puget Sound. I walked into the primary office and stood behind the massive leather desk. It was quiet. The war was over. But as I placed my manila folder on the polished wood, the heavy oak door behind me clicked open. I turned, expecting to see Marcus Thorne or a nervous junior assistant. 3 men stood in the doorway. They did not wear bespoke suits or carry legal briefcases. They wore dark, tailored overcoats, projecting a quiet, terrifying authority. The man in the center stepped into the office, closing the door softly behind him. He possessed cold, dark eyes and a demeanor that suggested he rarely had to repeat himself. "Ms. Lawrence," the man said, his voice smooth and heavily accented, "we apologize for the intrusion. We bypassed your front desk." "Who are you?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady, despite the sudden spike of adrenaline. "You are trespassing in a private executive office." "We are not trespassing," the man replied, pulling a thick, leather-bound dossier from his coat. "We hold the primary lien on your physical assets. We represent Red Dragon Capital." The blood turned to ice water in my veins. The Macau syndicate. The legal victory in the courtroom meant nothing to the men standing in my office. They did not care that James was going to prison or that Victoria was detained. They did not care about my mother's trust charter or the corporate charter. "The deadline has expired, Miss Lawrence," the syndicate representative stated, placing the dossier on the edge of my desk. "Your brother failed to transfer the $15 million balloon payment. The grace period is over. We are here to seize the fleet." I stared at the leather folder. I had successfully defeated my brother and sister-in-law, only to inherit their catastrophic debt. I had won the empire, but the true predators had arrived to collect the spoils. "You have 12 hours, Ms. Lawrence," the man continued, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "By midnight tonight, the $15 million must clear our offshore accounts. If the funds are not verified, we will lock down the port, expel your crews, and liquidate the freighters." He did not raise his voice or issue a physical threat. He did not have to. The certainty in his tone was absolute. 12 hours, the man repeated. He turned and walked out of the office, his 2 silent companions following him. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent executive suite. I looked out the massive windows at the Seattle waterfront, where the cranes were still moving cargo in the gray afternoon light. My hard-won empire was about to turn to dust before I even sat in the chair. I needed to find $15 million in liquid cash before midnight, and my corporate accounts were completely empty. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent executive suite. The footsteps of the syndicate representatives faded down the carpeted hallway until the only sound remaining was the steady patter of Seattle rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood behind the mahogany desk, staring at the empty space where the men had just been. 12 hours. The words echoed in the quiet room. I had navigated a labyrinth of corporate fraud, survived a physical ambush on the docks, and executed a flawless legal trap in a federal courtroom. I had ripped my family empire from the hands of a thief and an assassin. I had won the war. But the spoils of that war were currently sitting on a ticking time bomb, and the timer was about to reach 0. I walked around the desk, but I did not sit in my father's heavy leather chair. I felt no desire to claim his throne. I reached out and woke the primary executive terminal. The screen glowed to life, demanding a biometric login or an encrypted password. James had locked down the suite. But an auditor always leaves a back door. During my first year in the sub-basement, I had designed a fail-safe diagnostic protocol for the accounting department. I typed the sequence of administrative commands into the keyboard, overriding the primary firewall and dropping directly into the master financial dashboard of Lawrence Maritime. I needed to see the exact numerical reality of my victory. I opened the central operating accounts. The screen populated with rows of digital ledgers. I scanned the balances, my eyes tracking the columns of black text. Zeros. Endless rows of zeros. The payroll account held barely enough to cover the weekly wages of the dock workers. The emergency fuel reserves were drawn down to the legal minimum. The operational contingency fund was an empty shell. Victoria had been terrifyingly efficient. Before the judge remanded her into federal custody, she had utilized Cobalt Horizon to siphon every available drop of liquid capital out of the company. The offshore accounts had swallowed the wealth of our empire, leaving Lawrence Maritime gasping for air. I closed my eyes, resting my hands flat against the cool wood of the desk. My father used to boast about his impenetrable cash flow. He told investors that Lawrence Maritime could weather any global economic storm because his vaults were full. He raised my brother to believe that corporate wealth was an infinite resource, a magic well that would never run dry, regardless of how many sports cars or luxury estates he purchased. While James treated the treasury like a personal playground, I had spent my 20s living in a cramped walk-up apartment, rationing my winter heating bill. I tracked every misallocated dollar in the logistics department, fighting to save fractions of a cent on shipping routes. I understood the fragile mechanics of capital. I knew that a shipping company without cash was just a collection of very expensive scrap metal. I opened my eyes and reached for the platinum desk phone. I could not manifest $15 million from an empty ledger. I needed external financing, and I needed it before midnight. I dialed the direct line for Richard Sterling, the chairman of the Pacific Port Authority and the lead risk officer for the Municipal Banking Consortium. He was the man I had handed a black folder to last night at the Fairmont Olympic Gala. The line rang twice before he answered. "Adelaide Lawrence," he said, his tone clipped and guarded. "I just watched the afternoon news. Congratulations on your legal victory. The market is currently processing the arrest of your brother and his wife. I do not have time to celebrate, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The internal audits are worse than I projected. James left the operating accounts drained. I have a balloon payment due to an overseas creditor tonight. I need a $15 million bridge loan wired to the primary corporate account by 10 o'clock this evening." A long silence stretched across the phone line. I could hear the faint sound of harbor traffic through his receiver. "I cannot do that, Adelaide," he said. His voice was not malicious, but it was undeniably final. "I own the company outright," I countered, gripping the phone receiver. "The court granted me total, unencumbered executive control. I am the sole proprietor of a fleet worth $50 million. I have the collateral to back the loan." "You have the collateral," Richard agreed, "but you have zero institutional credibility. You walked into that ballroom last night and detonated a bomb. You proved to every major financier in the Pacific Northwest that Lawrence Maritime is compromised. We do not know the full extent of the fraud. We do not know if the federal government will freeze the remaining assets pending their investigation." "I eliminated the fraud," I argued, my pulse quickening. "I am cleaning up the mess. And the banking consortium respects you for it," he replied. "But traditional lending requires weeks of underwriting board approvals and risk assessment. We cannot wire $15 million to a company that was just decapitated in a federal courtroom 4 hours ago. The board will not authorize it. You burned the bridge to save the company, Adelaide. You cannot ask us to walk across the ashes today." He disconnected the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, mechanical sound of total rejection. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle. Richard Sterling was right. My tactical strike at the gala had worked too well. I had publicly destroyed my brother's reputation to prevent him from securing a fraudulent loan, but in doing so, I had rendered Lawrence Maritime too toxic for any legitimate financial institution to touch. I had isolated the company to save it. I turned away from the desk, pacing the length of the executive suite. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long gray shadows across the plush Persian rug. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked with a slow, rhythmic precision. 7 hours left. I ran a rapid asset liquidation projection in my mind. I could sell the heavy gantry cranes on Pier 46. I could leverage the downtown headquarters building. I could auction off the secondary storage warehouses. But commercial real estate and heavy machinery transactions require 30 days of escrow minimum. They require environmental inspections, title searches, and legal drafting. Red Dragon Capital did not want property deeds or promises of future capital. They wanted a wire transfer routing through their offshore servers by midnight. If the funds did not clear, they would execute the default clause. Private security teams would swarm the docks. They would chain the gates, expel Hank and his crew, and board the Aurora and the Pacific Queen. The legacy my mother fought to build would be stripped apart and sold to foreign salvage yards. I stopped pacing and stood in the center of the dark office. I had outsmarted a corrupt CEO. I had defeated a ruthless corporate assassin. I had utilized the federal justice system to reclaim my birthright. But I could not outsmart math. I walked behind the desk and finally sat down in my father's heavy leather chair. It felt cold and hollow. I leaned back, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. I'd sacrificed my relationship with my family. I had risked federal prison. I had fought a brutal war only to win a graveyard. The sheer weight of the impending failure pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the heavy parchment. I pulled out the original 1996 irrevocable trust document, the single piece of paper that had ignited this entire inferno. I laid it flat on the dark polished wood of the desk. I turned on the brass desk lamp, bathing the document in a pool of warm yellow light. I stared at the dense, typewritten paragraphs. I traced the faded ink signature of my late mother. She had been a brilliant logistician, a woman who understood the unforgiving nature of the shipping industry better than anyone. She would not have purchased a massive fleet of ocean freighters without establishing a contingency plan. She was too smart to leave her legacy vulnerable to the exact kind of shadow predators currently circling the docks. My eyes drifted to the dark red wax seal resting at the bottom corner of the page. I had looked at this seal a dozen times over the last 2 days. I had assumed it was merely a traditional notary stamp, a ceremonial family crest pressed into hot wax to formalize the legal binding. But as the sharp light from the desk lamp hit the wax at a low angle, the shadows shifted. I leaned closer, my face inches from the parchment. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. The dark red surface was not a smooth ceremonial crest. It was heavily textured. The ridges and valleys pressed into the wax were too geometric, too precise to be a decorative design. I squinted, focusing my eyes on the microscopic details. Hidden within the circular border of the wax seal, barely visible to the naked eye, was a micro-embossed sequence of numbers. I reached out my index finger, trembling slightly, as I traced the raised numerals. It was a long, unbroken string of digits. It did not look like a date or a legal filing code. It looked exactly like an international banking routing sequence. I shifted my gaze from the wax seal to the faded watermark embedded deep within the fibers of the heavy parchment. I had seen the logo before when I first cracked the envelope, but I had dismissed it as standard international stationery. It was the emblem of a private, secure, Swiss financial institution, an institution known globally for managing untouchable, generational wealth. The breath caught in my throat as the magnitude of the discovery washed over me. The document resting on my desk was not simply a legal lien establishing ownership of the physical ships. It was not just a claim to a throne. It was a literal map to a vault. My mother had not just left me the legal ammunition to fight my brother, she had left me the capital to win the war. I grabbed my laptop, pulling it toward the center of the desk. The clock on the wall ticked forward. I had 6 hours left to breach a Swiss bank account I had not known existed 5 minutes ago. The brass desk lamp cast a tight circle of yellow illumination across the polished mahogany surface. I leaned in, bringing my face mere inches from the 1996 irrevocable trust document. The clock on the wall indicated I had less than 6 hours remaining before the Macau Shadow Syndicate locked down the Seattle waterfront. My heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I reached out and ran the pad of my index finger over the dark red wax seal, resting at the bottom corner of the heavy parchment. The surface was not smooth. The geometric ridges pressed into the hardened crimson material were deliberate. I traced the microscopic indentations, feeling the distinct shapes of individual numerals. It was a 12-digit sequence, hidden in plain sight, masquerading as a decorative family crest. I recognized the numerical format immediately. I had spent 10 years in the logistics department, processing international vendor payments and reconciling foreign cargo manifests. The pattern of numbers embedded in the wax matched the exact structural requirements of an international bank account number. My gaze drifted upward, shifting from the red seal to the center of the page. I scrutinized the faded watermark pressed deep into the fibrous weave of the paper. It depicted a highly stylized shield flanked by 2 rampant lions. Beneath the crest, a line of elegant typography spelled out Banque Privée de Genève. It was an elite private financial institution located in Switzerland, specializing in ultra-secure wealth management for generational estates. The pieces of the puzzle locked together, forming a picture of staggering foresight. My mother grew up in a working-class neighborhood, learning early that financial security was a fragile illusion. When she married my father and began purchasing ocean freighters, she witnessed his dangerous tendency to leverage reliable assets for risky short-term expansion. She loved the man, but she did not trust his financial discipline. She knew his ego would eventually threaten the foundations of the shipping empire she was building. To protect her legacy, she constructed an impenetrable fortress. She did not just draft a legal lien to ensure the ships remained within her bloodline. She established a parallel treasury. She funded a dormant offshore account beyond the reach of my father and secured the access credentials within the very document proving her ownership. The parchment resting on my desk was the literal key to a hidden vault. I picked up the platinum executive receiver. My hands were shaking, but my mind was operating with crystalline focus. I dialed the international exit code followed by the country prefix for Switzerland. It was the middle of the night in Geneva, but elite financial institutions tasked with guarding billions of dollars never closed their doors. The line trilled twice before a measured, clipped voice answered. Banque Privée de Genève Client Services. The operator spoke in pristine, unaccented English. My name is Adelaide Lawrence, I stated, keeping my tone flat and authoritative. I am holding a verified trust instrument originating from your institution dated October 1996. I require immediate access to the associated legacy portfolio. Please hold, Ms. Lawrence, the operator replied. There was no hold music. The line went dead silent, a sterile vacuum of international telecommunications. I stared at the sweeping second hand of the grandfather clock in the corner of the office. The syndicate deadline was creeping closer. If this Swiss account held only a minor surplus, I was finished. If the funds had been depleted by exorbitant maintenance fees over the last 3 decades, the docks would fall to the repossession teams before sunrise. A new voice clicked onto the line. It belonged to a man possessing the clinical, detached cadence of a senior risk manager. Ms. Lawrence, my name is Henri. I am a managing director of legacy accounts. We have maintained a dormant file under your family's surname for 29 years. However, accessing this specific portfolio requires strict cryptographic authentication. The primary account holder established a zero-tolerance security protocol. I have the authorization sequence, I replied. Read it to me, Henri instructed. I placed my finger back onto the red wax seal. I read the 12 digits aloud, speaking slowly to ensure perfect clarity. I recited the numbers exactly as they were embossed, translating the tactile ridges into spoken data. "One moment," Henri said. The silence returned, stretching out into an agonizing void. I listened to the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite. I pictured the heavily armed Macau contractors waiting in their vehicles near Pier 46, watching their watches, waiting for the grace period to expire. My entire future depended on the mathematical verification occurring on a server thousands of miles away. "Authentication verified," Henri announced, breaking the tension. "The firewall is disabled. I am generating a secure web portal and transferring the encrypted link to your corporate email address now. We require secondary visual confirmation before initiating any external routing." I opened my laptop and refreshed my inbox. A message containing a complex cryptographic URL appeared. I clicked the link, entering the temporary credentials Henri dictated over the phone. The screen transitioned to a minimalist interface displaying the crest of the Swiss bank. A loading icon spun in the center of the monitor. The digital vault was opening. The portfolio summary materialized. I stared at the available liquid balance, $18,400,000. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a sudden, dizzying exhale. I slumped back into the heavy leather chair, my hands dropping away from the keyboard. It was enough. It was more than enough. My mother had carefully calculated the required capital necessary to defend her ships against future predators. The accrued interest over 3 decades had transformed her initial safety net into a formidable war chest. The account contained the exact funds required to eradicate the $15 million syndicate debt and possessed a $3 million surplus. That surplus provided the necessary financial leverage to aggressively purchase the Cobalt Horizon Shell Company out of existence, absorbing its assets back into Lawrence Maritime. She did not just leave me a legal claim to an empty throne. She left me the ammunition to enforce it. Henri said, sitting up straight and pulling the laptop closer. "I need to initiate a priority international wire transfer immediately. State the destination routing sequence," Henri replied, his keyboard clacking softly in the background. I retrieved the intercepted communication logs containing the Macau syndicate payment instructions. I read the SWIFT code and the receiving account digits to the Swiss director. I authorized a transfer of exactly $15 million. "We require a signed authorization document to release capital of this magnitude," Henri cautioned. "I am transmitting the release forms to your terminal. Print, sign, and transmit them back via the encrypted portal." I accessed the attached files, routing them to the laser printer sitting on the credenza behind the desk. The machine hummed, dispensing 3 pages of dense financial legalese. I grabbed my father's heavy fountain pen resting on the blotter. I signed my name on the bottom of each page, my signature sharp and decisive. I fed the documents into the high-speed scanner, uploading the digital copies directly into the Swiss banking portal. "Documents received and verified," Henri confirmed, initiating the wire transfer now. I watched the screen. The interface displayed a processing bar. The digital capital was moving across the globe, exiting the secure European vault, passing through international clearinghouses, and racing toward the shadow lenders waiting in Macau. The progress bar reached 100%. A green confirmation receipt illuminated the monitor. "Transfer complete," Henri stated. "The funds have successfully cleared the receiving institution. Is there anything else you require tonight, Ms. Lawrence?" "No, Henri," I replied, leaning back in the chair. "That will be all." I disconnected the call. The dial tone purred softly in the silent office. I looked out the window at the dark Seattle skyline. The syndicate threat was neutralized. The $15 million debt was erased. The overseas repo teams would receive their confirmation orders within minutes, and they would quietly withdraw from the waterfront. The Aurora, the Pacific Queen, and the rest of the heavy ocean freighters were safe. The corporate accounts were still empty, but the foundational assets were secure, giving me the breathing room required to rebuild the logistics empire on my own terms. I had navigated the storm, and secured the harbor. The shipping line belonged to me, unburdened by the corrupt machinations of my brother and his ruthless wife. But the war required one final act of closure. The legal and financial battles were won, but a personal reckoning remained unresolved. James was currently sitting in a federal holding facility waiting for his arraignment. He was stripped of his bespoke suits, his luxury vehicles, and his arrogant pride. I picked up my coat and walked toward the heavy oak door. I needed to look my brother in the eye. I needed to show him exactly who had inherited the kingdom and ensure he understood the permanence of his defeat. The morning sun broke through the Seattle clouds, casting a pale light across the mahogany desk. I had remained in the executive suite all night, watching the digital confirmation codes roll across my monitor. The Macau syndicate confirmed receipt of the wire transfer at exactly 11:45. Red Dragon Capital formally released the liens on the Aurora, the Pacific Queen, and the rest of the fleet. By dawn, my legal team had executed a hostile absorption of Cobalt Horizon Holdings, utilizing our surplus capital from the Swiss vault. The offshore entity dissolved into nothingness, its fraudulent structure collapsing under the weight of hard currency. The ships belonged to Lawrence Maritime again. They belonged to me. 4 days later, I drove south on Interstate 5 toward the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the highway slick and gray. I parked in the visitor lot, passed through 3 layers of reinforced security doors, and took a seat in a sterile, concrete visitation room. A guard escorted my brother through a heavy metal door. He did not look like the Golden Boy anymore. The bespoke charcoal suits and silk ties were gone, replaced by a stiff, standard-issue khaki uniform that hung loosely on his frame. His hair lacked its usual expensive styling, falling flat across his forehead. Dark circles framed his eyes. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He picked up the black plastic receiver on his side of the thick plexiglass. I picked up mine. "Addie," he said, his voice cracking a desperate rasp. "Thank God you came. Listen to me. You have to post my bail. Victoria is cooperating with the Cybercrimes Division. She is giving them everything to save herself. They are threatening me with 20 years. I looked at him, studying the panic in his eyes. I did not feel pity. I felt nothing at all. "The company accounts are empty, James," I reminded him, my tone flat and unyielding. "You drained them. Even if I wanted to post a multi-million-dollar bond, I do not have the liquid cash." "You found the Swiss account," he pleaded, pressing his hand against the scratched glass. "Sterling told my lawyers you paid off the syndicate. You have the money. We can negotiate a buyout. Buy my shares. Give me a golden parachute, just enough to hire a real defense team. I am your brother. You cannot leave me in here." He was still trying to negotiate. He still believed there was a back door, a loophole, a way to manipulate the system and avoid the consequences of his own greed. He thought blood tied me to his sinking ship. "You tried to send me to federal prison," I stated, keeping my voice even. "You hired a mercenary to break into my home. You stole my mother's legacy, and you watched our father treat me like a ghost for 30 years. I was desperate," he begged, tears welling in the corners of his eyes. "I made a mistake. I am sorry. Addie, please." I looked at the man who had sat at the head of the boardroom table just a few days ago, radiating smug superiority. I remembered the exact words he had delivered when he thought I was powerless and defeated. I held the receiver close to my mouth, ensuring the audio feed captured every syllable perfectly. "Maybe it is an apology for having you," I said. James froze. The color drained from his face as the echo of his own cruelty struck him. I placed the phone gently back onto the metal cradle, severing the connection. I stood up, turned my back on the glass window, and walked out of the visitation room. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked out into the crisp Washington air, leaving him trapped in a cage of his own design. Returning to the downtown headquarters, I initiated the physical cleansing of the executive suite. I requested a cardboard box and began emptying the heavy wooden drawers of my father's desk. I discarded his monogrammed golf balls, his expensive cigars, and the framed country club photographs. I was eradicating the museum of his ego. While clearing the bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against a false wooden panel. I pressed the edge, and the thin veneer popped loose, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside rested a small, sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my father's familiar, slanted handwriting. I tore the paper open, pulling out a single, handwritten page. It was dated 3 days before his sudden, fatal heart attack. "Adelaide," the note began. I knew he would ruin it. I saw the debt piling up, but I lacked the strength to stop him. I knew you would save the fleet. You always had your mother's iron spine. I am sorry I forced you to fight this war alone. Please forgive an old man for his weakness. I stared at the blue ink. It was a plea for posthumous absolution. My father wanted me to pardon his cowardice because he had finally acknowledged my competence. He thought handing me a broken company justified a lifetime of neglect. He wanted to rest in peace knowing I had fixed his disaster. I did not cry. I did not feel a sudden rush of sentimental forgiveness. The world loves to tell women to be the peacemakers in toxic families, to carry the burdens and pardon the men who drop them. I refused to grant him that comfort. I walked over to the heavy-duty cross-cut shredder standing near the filing cabinets. I fed the handwritten note directly into the machine. The steel blades whirred to life, slicing his final words into thousands of unreadable paper ribbons. I returned to the desk and dialed the Port Authority dispatch line. I asked for Hank. The grizzled dockmaster answered the radio channel a minute later, his voice gruff over the static. "The operations chief position is vacant," I told him, skipping the formalities. "I need someone who actually understands how shipping containers move, not a kid with an advanced business degree." "The job is yours if you want it. I will start tomorrow morning," Hank replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "Thank you, boss." A knock at the door interrupted the quiet. 2 building maintenance workers entered carrying a large cardboard box. They unboxed a sleek, ergonomic mesh office chair. I instructed them to remove the heavy, suffocating leather throne my father had occupied for 3 decades. They rolled the old artifact out the door, leaving the modern, breathable chair in its place. I sat down behind the desk. The new chair provided firm, responsive support. I turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling expanse of Puget Sound. The rain had cleared entirely, revealing the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Olympic Mountains in the distance. Down at the deep-water berth, the Aurora was preparing to cast off. The immense engines rumbled, sending a deep vibration through the glass of my office. The captain pulled the lanyard, and a deafening blast from the ship horn echoed across the harbor, signaling her departure. She was heading out to the open Pacific, loaded with cargo unburdened by shadow debt or offshore liens. She was moving out to sea under my command. I had burned the toxic remnants of my family to the ground, and from those ashes, I had forged an empire that belonged solely to me. That is my story. I survived the ambush and took the crown. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to remember something critical. Loyalty to a corrupt family is not a virtue. It is a slow death. Sometimes the only way to save a legacy is to rip it from the hands of the people who do not deserve it. Have you ever had to walk away from your own blood to protect your future? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If my journey resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Sophia Told Stories has more content just like this waiting for you. Stay strong and never let anyone convince you to sign away your worth. I will see you in the next one.
We spend our fleeting lives building. We build careers, we build bank accounts, and if we are profoundly fortunate, we build families. But what happens when the foundation of a family is poured not with the enduring concrete of honesty and fairness, but with the fragile, glittering glass of avoidance, and unchecked entitlement? The saga of the Lawrence family is much more than a corporate thriller played out in Seattle's towering high-rises. It is a profound, cautionary reflection on modern American parenting. It holds up a mirror to our own living rooms and forces us to ask ourselves a terrifying, necessary question. Are we raising children who possess the fortitude to weather the darkest storms? Or are we simply handing them expensive umbrellas that will instantly collapse at the first sign of real rain? Consider the patriarch, Richard Lawrence. Here was a man who successfully constructed a $50 million maritime empire, a man who commanded fleets of freighters and dictated international supply chains. Yet he failed spectacularly in the single most vital, irreplaceable duty of a parent: moral stewardship. The story reveals that Richard knew his son James was actively bleeding the company dry. He saw the financial hemorrhage, yet he completely lacked the courage to disown his son publicly or hold him accountable. This is the silent, devastating tragedy of parental cowardice. Within the traditional family structure, we often confuse our deep love for our children with a desire to shield them from all conflict and consequence. We want to protect them from the harsh realities of their own poor choices, quietly hoping that our silent indulgence will magically inspire them to mature. But true love, the kind of fierce, devoted love that sustains generations and builds genuine character, requires the courage to hold our children strictly accountable. It requires us to value their ethical development over their professional status or public image. By avoiding the painful but necessary confrontation with his golden boy son, Richard did not save James. He condemned him to a life of hollow greed. Furthermore, Richard's cowardice forced his daughter Adelaide to fight a bitter, exhausting war that her father should have settled years before. Instead of passing down a legacy of clarity, unity, and justice, he left her a weapon. He left behind heavily indebted shells and fractured sibling bonds for his children to fix. Look closely at James and Victoria. They represent the quintessential, polished golden boy and his pristine wife, serving as the perfect avatars for the hungry ghosts of modern corporate greed. They had everything that wealth, privilege, and access could offer, yet they felt so spiritually empty that they resorted to embezzlement, forgery, and digital framing to grasp for more. When parents prioritize the appearance of success over the substance of integrity, they raise hungry ghosts. In American culture, where achievement is so frequently measured by job titles, exclusive zip codes, and material accumulation, it is dangerously easy to neglect the cultivation of the soul. James and Victoria's ultimate downfall was not merely a legal or financial failure. It was a profound spiritual decay. They believed they were untouchable, wrapped tightly in the protective armor of their elite status. But the universe has a highly effective way of balancing the scales. Every action, every deceit, leaves a footprint. In this modern age, that karma manifests as a literal digital footprint. For James and Victoria, their own dishonest actions, from offshore Cayman accounts to the hiring of professional hits, became the very evidence that secured their undeniable ruin. When we do not teach our children emotional awareness and absolute ethical boundaries, their own unchecked desires will eventually become their jailers. And then there is Adelaide. Her arduous journey is a beautiful, striking testament to the quiet, unyielding power of resilience and self-cultivation. When the storm finally broke, she did not have the luxury of a golden safety net. Her bank accounts were frozen. She was vastly outgunned by billionaires, and her very life was threatened on the cold, rain-slicked concrete of Pier 46. Yet she survived, and she conquered. She succeeded because she possessed the wisdom to look beneath the superficial surface of things. With auditor precision, she examined the Cayman leases and the Public Port Authority logs. She saw right through the polished illusions of the glass-walled boardrooms. As parents, this is the exact brand of resilience we must strive to instill in our children. We must teach them that willpower is not about loud aggression or theatrical dominance. It is the steady, bloodless execution of one's duty, even when the world around you is pouring rain. While her brother committed spectacular perjury under oath, driven by panic and ego, Adelaide maintained her icy composure. She anchored herself deeply to the truth. The story beautifully demonstrates that while deceit may offer a rapid, intoxicating shortcut to power, pure integrity is the only bedrock that can withstand the guillotine of reality. Stories like Adelaide's remind us that the massive dramas playing out in boardrooms and courtrooms are almost always born in the living rooms and kitchens of our childhoods. They are the lingering echoes of the conversations we had with our parents, or, more tragically, the conversations we deliberately avoided. If exploring these deep, emotional intersections of family dynamics, legacy, and human resilience moves you, I warmly invite you to subscribe and follow our channel, Sophia Told Stories. We delve into the complex narratives that challenge us, shape us, and ultimately reveal exactly who we are when the masks finally come off. In the end, the true legacy we leave our children is rarely the capital sitting in our investment accounts. It is the wax seal on the envelopes of their character, the hidden, dormant potential that can only be unlocked through trials, tribulations, and the pursuit of truth. Adelaide eventually found the ammunition she needed, hidden within her mother's trust. But she only reached it because she absolutely refused to fold under immense pressure. She learned the hardest, most liberating lesson of all. To live a better, more authentic life, we must sometimes shred the hidden notes of our past excuses, just as she resolutely shredded her father's cowardly plea for posthumous forgiveness. She realized she had to take absolute command of her own fleet. As the lights dim on the Lawrence family saga, we are left standing in the quiet, staring at our own reflections. When the final ledger of your life is audited and the material wealth is entirely stripped away, what will truly remain in the hearts and minds of the children you raised? Will they be left holding the hollow, crumbling shells of a golden facade? Or will they be standing firmly at the helm, capable of navigating the darkest, most treacherous waters entirely on their own? The answer to that question is not waiting in the future. It is already being written, line by line, in the quiet, unseen moments of today.